Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot and welcome to my watercolor demo of a street scene based on a Google Street View image. In this watercolor, we'll be covering a few watercolor techniques like laying down a wash, wet in wet, blending colors, negative painting, as in painting around figures and boats, plus some dry brushstrokes. I'll also take you through the normal stages I go through in a painting and covering timings. Now in this demo, I'll be showing you how I would use Google Street View as a subject for a watercolor painting. This was an excellent suggestion actually from one of my followers, so if anyone else watching has any other good ideas for future subjects, please let me know. Email me at timothywilmot@gmail.com. I think that one of the challenges of painting, certainly for me, and especially watercolor, is finding a suitable subject to paint and something that works well with watercolor. Of course, with Google Street View, the world is your oyster. It can be overwhelming to decide on a location, so it might be best to start with and stick with areas that you're familiar with, or maybe based on some recommendation to you. Now, the area I'm looking at with this painting, the location for this painting, is Pin Mill, a popular area for artists and a venue for painting holidays. Pin Mill is on the east coast of the UK and is a typical English country scene with sort of an estuary, riverside scene, old boats and barges. So let's now go to this location, Pin Mill, zoom in a little bit further and then access Street View, drag and drop that little guy to the location we want to start from. And this might normally be a typical view here that most artists would choose, boats, barges, the riverside view. So I'm just spanning around now looking for a suitable image, do a 180 degree, 360 degree, all the way around there. And really we're looking for something with suitable light, something suitable for watercolor, maybe something against the light. And I think this actually would, now this scene here would make a suitable watercolor subject against the light. This boatyard here with some boats, and we'll introduce some extra figures and try and adjust the scene, trying to make it our own. So on with the painting then. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford, rough texture. The size is in Imperial, it's 15 inches by 11 inches. I've got it taped down on some Corex board, and you can see my palette there to the right hand side and the reference photo, just a copy of that Google Street View image there in the top right corner. So doing the outline sketch with a 3B pencil, and starting as I normally do on the left hand side, worked away across, did the roof line there, and now I'm getting in boat number 1. They're quite simple shapes really, boats. You just got the top of the boat and the hull, and certainly a lot easier when you're actually drawing them end on, although this one I'm doing just a slight acute angle and a little bit smaller. Just roughly drawn in. Also, I'm thinking at this stage where the light is coming from and trying to thinking ahead what areas of the painting are going to be light, what areas are going to be dark, what areas are going to be of maximum contrast as well. So notice here I'm actually doing something a little bit different just to balance out those two boats on the left. I'm just introducing a third boat on the right up on its stilts or supports. And then thinking about the background. Those background trees there. And shadow, or the shadow outline. I think I'm going to introduce a foreground shadow here. So I've got a bit of interest, bit of difference in contrast as I come down from the top of the picture. So we've got the sky, and then we've got the dark background, and then the highlighted boats, and then the middle ground highlighted, and then the foreground in dark. So you've got those. I think that works quite well in watercolor. Those different bands coming down from the top, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, and so on. Now, so introduce some figures. Figure number 1. Trying to decide whether it's coming towards me or away from me. Maybe you're carrying something. And then another figure, just loosely drawn in, and the shadow. And let's think about a third figure, a little bit smaller, further away. And let's have this one pushing a sack truck or something similar. After all, it is a boat yard, so there should be people working in the area and pushing things, pulling things. Now the crane. Sometimes I might drawing things like this, a crane mast. Other times I'll just paint them in, so as I don't show any pencil lines. So the crane's pointing in towards the center of the picture, just, and then the sign on the boatyard. So just thinking about where the shadows are going to be again. Just making sure I've got a bit more definition on the figures. When I go over with my shadows, just want to still be able to see what's going on. So I think we're nearly done there with the outline sketch. So before I start painting proper, let me take you through the palette, and from the top we've got neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt turquoise, cerulean blue in the middle, almost in the middle there, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, scarlet red, or cadmium red, cadmium orange, light red, cadmium orange, and then cadmium yellow right down the bottom left hand corner there. So with a mop brush, I'm just applying some yellow ochre, weak yellow ochre here, across the horizon, over the whole painting. And now picking up some cerulean blue, over the top of that, and just letting it, there is a slight slope on this board, so it's going to come down just a little bit to meet the yellow ochre. Sorry for the glare there. That will go away as obviously as it all dries. Now some bit of a mixture here, cad red, just going with something darker as an initial wash for the background, painting around those boats. The nice thing with a mop brush is that when there's not too much, when it's not holding too much paint, you can actually get quite a nice edge to it as well, which you would have seen just then. It does help you maintain sharp edges, or helping you go around shapes. So the foreground is quite warm. This is mainly a burnt sienna wash here. Notice I'm just picking up colours as I'm going down through with the wash, adding in some extra colours while it's still obviously moist. That makes for a more interesting overall look rather than too flat. You can see the actual texture of the paper coming through. This is as I say, this is rough texture, which does help with the sort of granulation as well of the washes. So a little bit darker on the left hand side, up to those figures around the boat, around figure number 1 and figure number 2. So actually paint over the legs, generally leaving the main torso unpainted, but paint over the legs and paint over the face, because we can go in later on with a little bit of body paint, bit of thicker paint for the faces, so don't worry about painting over the faces there. So we're now nearing the end of the initial stage, the wash. I'm just looking for anything that I might have left out, just splattering in a little bit of clear water there, just to again add a bit more textural differences to the foreground. And then I've just got to let this dry 100%. It's got to be bone dry before we go to the next stage. So I'm just picking up a synthetic brush there just to do a bit more splattering. So everything's dry now, and we're ready to start with the background and gradually come forwards. Now the brush I'm using here is it's a brush I actually quite like at the moment. It's a Raphael brush, size 6 I think, so it's a sort of medium-ish mop brush. It's actually synthetic, but you can see here, I'll just put it on the side, you actually got quite a nice edge to it. Excuse the fly buzzing around there. Quite a nice edge to it. So just going with the background, leave out some highlights. Insects don't bother me unless they land on the painting. So that's the base of the crane. Around that boat, add a bit more blue, a bit of burnt sienna. Quite dark for the shroud. It's going to make a nice contrast against the hull of the boat. So I'm just using the side of the brush. Neutral tint at the top. I normally, when I'm mixing with neutral tint, I keep that in a separate palette just so it doesn't contaminate the other areas where I'm mixing my colours. So quite dark at the base of the background there. And really the back of that boatyard is just a random area of different shapes. Difficult really to pick out what really is there. Boats or vehicles or cranes. Me with this fly is fast becoming a double act. Right, the shadow. Shadow's going across there. So lights over on the left hand side. Allows us to have some nice shadows going from left to right. So I've got a sort of fairly small synthetic brush here for the crane. Just put that in lightly. As I said earlier, sometimes I might, with things like cranes and masts, I might actually pencil them in first of all, or just al fresco add them in with applying the brush straight onto the paper, not actually following any lines at all. And then with that chain coming down from the crane, notice I leave out just a few gaps there. So here we are with a few masts just to indicate the boatyard. So I think we're ready to make a start on the boats now. They've been left out so far. So that left one is going to be a dark blue. So I've got a bit of cobalt, bit of ultramarine blue. I've returned to my Raphael brush here. Nice point, almost with a side. Quite a bit of moisture in the brush. So that's the top. Now the hull, a little bit lighter. And let the top of the boat bleed into the bottom. Doesn't matter. I'll actually paint around that figure's head. And then boat number 2, in a similar way, start with the top. So this left hand side is actually going to be in some light, so I think I'm going to have to go a little bit darker on the right hand side just to emphasize the light hitting the left hand side. So fairly light on the hull. Just use my finger there, or anything that comes to hand. And as well as fingers, the odd bit of a paper towel. Notice that background was just a little bit too dark, so I'm just, while it's still moist, just lifting out some of the colour there just to make it a bit lighter, and again it just adds a little bit more interest to it, so it's not too flat. Right, back with my trusty Raphael brush, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue. Try and get the colour absolutely right. So background buildings. Again, I've made that mop brush into a flat shape, so I can give some indication to the roof tiles. And now the main boatyard building. I'll paint around that sign. I'll come back to that later on. And don't worry that you'll notice here I'm actually leaving out little gaps, little random gaps. It doesn't really matter. That's just my own style. Other people might paint over everything, not leave any gaps at all, but as I come down through a wash like this, I do leave out little gaps. You'd have seen that with the background. I'm doing exactly the same with the building. Coming a little bit darker as I'm coming down towards the middle and the base of the building. right over to the edge. Make sure I go over the edge on top of the masking tape so I don't leave any nasty gaps as I peel off the tape at the end. I get through quite a lot of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. It's pretty dominant combination I use in a lot of my paintings. So back to the main building, as I say, coming darker as we're coming down, add in a bit of neutral tint there, speed up the process. Could use Payne's grey if you don't have neutral tint. Most of these colours are Winsor and Newton. Again, excuse the finger. Right, so quite dark on the left hand side. That's where the deepest shadows were. My friend the fly is coming back. So I've got some really dark mixture going on there right in the top, mixing well, or mixing palette. So making this a bit warmer now with that cadmium red and alizarin crimson added to it. Trying to sort of, these shadows are inheriting that warm, the warm surface, so not too cool. Carefully painting around those two figures with the shadows. So ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, got a sort of purplish mix. Go back up into some of the upper wash while it's still moist. So now for the foreground shadows, using the side of the brush, dragging across, and again useful to have that rough texture paper so it adds a kind of soft edge to those shadows as they're extending away from the left hand side. Right, the base of the hull, bit of a reddish colour there. And now focusing on boat number 2 with a bit of a shadow coming across the bow of that boat, probably from that larger boat, and then the stern. And the top of the boat that's in shadow there, bit of a window. And then while it's still moist, just dab around a little bit. Just helps with the blending in of those different washes while everything is still moist. Now back with my synthetic brush, the actual building is dried just a little bit. Tiny bit of dampness still in the wash there. So let's now turn our attention to the figures. So with a medium or small synthetic brush, let's start off with their faces. Hands. I always start off with the face first, then hands or arms second. And the body, thinking about where the sun's coming from. And the legs, I don't really pay too much attention to the legs. I think the more you concentrate on the legs, the less realistic they can look. So back on that left hand figure, a darker head, and then torso, and legs. Try not to overdo it. So some shadows for the figures. Very lightly, not too much detail. A little bit of lost and found with them as well, just to indicate some rough texture to the ground, and then whatever that figure is carrying. So the third distant figure, a little bit quicker to paint this one because it's in the background, and then it's pushing a sack truck. So this one's all done with the one brush, shadow and all. Now that boat that's up on its stilts, add a bit of definition to the top of the hull and the superstructure on top of the hull, leaving the left hand side highlighted with the light coming against it, and then the front of it in a little bit of a shade, and then the bow just smudge it a bit with a finger. So back with my Raphael brush, Let's do the sign of the boatyard. Now, because this is an old building, you don't need to be too exact with the washes here. And as you saw there, I've sort of had a few different tones in that wash there. A bit more splattering. Try not to get it on my camera. Back with the synthetic brush, let's do the supports for that yacht. Just add in a few more dots around the place, and where the foreground was, where I've got little light patches, I can make little rocks or indentations out of those, just with some shadow behind them. And in the foreground shadows as well. So now a bit of definition to the boats by adding in a line. Always makes boats look a little bit more realistic by adding in that line along the top of the hull. Either a single line or a double line. So it's actually not very moist, this paint, so just dragging it across the hull, and it does help having rough paper as well. Adding in the door of the boatyard building, bit of a cobalt blue. And then just adding in some darker shadows or shapes to the background when I've still got that colour on that brush. Let's add another line to this boat, just to emphasize the curve of the boat. And then bottom of the hull. So I can still dab some areas out. It does take, using Saunders, I do find with the cotton-based paper, it does take a longer time to dry than say Bockingford, which is paper, 100% paper. It takes a lot longer to dry, so it's you've got a fair bit of time to make adjustments and lift out colours if you want to. So with some dry brush strokes here. Some tire marks maybe. Add a bit of a darker face to that figure. Looks a little bit better. So this sign, let's add some writing in. It doesn't need to be too exact. Sometimes when I'm doing signs or road signs, I just put in a few marks just to indicate letters rather than actually writing something that you could read. So when I've still got that dark colour, I'm just going around different areas. The tops of boats, there's always something going on, little hooks and ropes and handles and fixtures that you can just keep adding to. Let's add in a mast now for that yacht. A little bit of lost and found, not a continuous line. One or two gaps in there. Now just adding in some extra lines for those tiles of the roof. At this stage I'm probably not sure what I'm doing with those figures, whether to add more detail or leave them be. So let's actually add something to the crane. It's lifting up something. So I'm adding a bit more definition to that doorway. And where I've got those little random white bits that I left out on the wash of the building, just adding a bit of dark shadows to the right of those. So I think we're nearing the final stages of this painting now. I'm thinking about, well, I use some white gouache to add in a few highlights. I think we need a little ladder on one of the boats just to indicate that maybe some work's being done on it, and there's a ladder leaning against it, so I can use some white gouache for that. And I'll take it just straight from the tube with a damp brush, a small synthetic brush. Just get the right consistency. So think before you apply the brush. Gouache can be very difficult to remove if you get it wrong. Yeah, so let's just add in a little ladder here. And then just a few rungs of the ladder. It's sort of disappearing into the shadows. So I think we'll add a bit more white to the, little bits of white to the background. First the bit of a structure on top of that second boat. Add a highlight to that third figure. Maybe different things catching the light on top of the boats there. And then a bit of a highlight on that main figure. And I think we're nearly done. Yeah, it just needs a little bit brighter there on that ladder, just where it's catching the light. Yep, I think we're done. So here's the finished painting, and hopefully you found that a useful exercise in using a Google Street View image as a reference for a watercolor painting. And so in summary, I think when you're using Google Street View, you've got to choose a location that's familiar to you, or maybe based on a recommendation. Be careful with the perspective, because obviously the Google camera is on top of a car, so it's probably maybe 2.5 meters, maybe more, above the ground. so you've got to make an adjustment for that. And also change elements of what you see, introduce people, cars, trying to make it your own, not copying exactly what you see in front of you. And don't worry if it's a cloudy day, just invent your own shadows. So hopefully, as I say, you've enjoyed that. Have a go yourself at Google Street View. Please catch a lot more of my work at my website www.timwilmot.com, and hopefully catch up with you soon on another watercolor video. Cheers.